It's the Wonkhe Show. Universities are cutting bursaries, freezing hiring and eyeing mergers. And new data shows the sector's finances are only going one way. International student visas are at their lowest level in years. We'll discuss the implications. And belonging is doing lots of work in the student experience. Friends have benefits, it turns out, but can students get them and keep them? It's all coming up.
I often think that student services are essentially going to be treated like, like the wet paper towel you used to get at primary school if you fell over, which didn't really do the job, but maybe tried to make you feel a little bit better.
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Jim Dickinson, and here to help us cut through the noise, as usual, three excellent guests. In Biggleswade, Emma Maslin is Senior Policy Research Officer at AMOSSHE. Emma, your highlight of the week, please.
So, using the lovely bank holiday sunshine, as part of a hen do, I visited Eyam in Derbyshire, which is known as the Plague Village, where I learned all about how in the 1600s the village isolated itself to protect nearby community from an outbreak of the Black Death.
How exciting. There's, at the very least, a link to a Wikipedia article in the show notes. In Leeds, Neil Mackenzie is Chief Exec at Leeds Beckett Students Union. Neil, your highlight of the week, please.
Well, Sunday was an absolutely magical day, last day of the Premier League, and as a massive Sunderland fan, you may well see this Mackem in Milan. Sunderland have qualified for Europe for the first time since 1973. It's the best league performance since 1958, and it was just a magical time in the North East, wasn't it, James?
And in Darlington this week, James Curry is Associate Editor at Wonkhe. James, your highlight of the week, please.
Hello, listeners. Speaking of plagues, I dropped my daughter off in the big room at nursery today. So it's her first day with a whole new group of children whose illnesses I will certainly be catching over the next 3 to 6 months. Looking forward to it.
Yes, as happens in close, tight-knit communities, which we'll get to. So yes, we start this week with university finances and the growing evidence of what cuts are actually doing on the ground. Jimbo, UK has done a survey. What's it say?
Jim, that was the single clumsiest segue to a segment I think you have ever done in all the time we've been recording this podcast together. Yes, so UK have a new survey out looking at the savings that institutions are making, what they're thinking about the future. There's 140 universities that responded. In typical fashion, Jim, in the intro, you focused on the cost to the bursaries that institutions are undertaking. Around 27% are cutting them compared to 50% last year. However, aside from some of these institutional cost savings, there's some interesting things going on. There seems to be evidence that universities are massively considering upping their collaborations. A lot of that is around digital transformation, shared procurement, as you'd expect. But interestingly, nearly 2/3 are considering federations or alliances, and 2 in 5 are open to or actively considering mergers. Elsewhere, there's institutions making lots of savings in staff, but there is much, much less savings being made in research than you anticipate, with only around 31% having made cuts to academic research activity. Given it is both expensive and loss-making, that seems quite surprising to me. So, nothing that's probably too surprising. Lots of pressures, lots of savings, but some interesting models in federations and collaborations being explored.
Well, fascinating stuff. Let's get into a bit of the detail. Emma, this stuff about collaborations, mergers, and so on. I guess on the one hand, this might be an opportunity for universities to save on some of those costs that people don't see, some of the kind of the boring stuff, the administrative, the procurement stuff, and so on. But the wave of mergers across Europe over the past 10 years has also meant lots of campuses closing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this appetite for, shared services, resources, procurement, acquisitions, we know that this kind of stuff is being encouraged by policymakers, and actually it might offer this kind of breathing space for those providers who are struggling under the weight of the cuts in its current form. But obviously all of this work in order to understand the kinds of shared services, etc., that might be useful to avoid things like cutting campuses entirely, that requires the time, the staffing and the headspace to develop and enact those changes. And that's at a time when, regulatory and governmental expectation, and I'm talking specifically in student services, where our kind of membership is such where it feels like the stakes are getting increasingly higher with the high penalty for quote unquote getting it wrong. And I do think, James mentioned here, there's a real opportunity here for positive change and efficiency in a way that doesn't just scream cost cutting, but efficient services and policies and processes that actually work.
The thing that I struggle with, Emma, like on your point, is collaborating seems like a massive pain and really hard, particularly on a formal basis like Cranfield Kings or Greenwich Kent. Yet, according to that survey, 40% of respondents are actively considering it. Like, what are the conditions that make that possible? Because it seems that the government just don't regulate in a way to make it helpful or easy or even possible to do.
Yeah, and I think the people that filled out this survey are the finance directors, right? But they're not the only people that will be responsible for making those decisions and thinking about the implications and the conditions required. So I think I don't have the answer, basically, but I do think that there are a lot people might be considering it, but that doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. And I think that will be interesting as well to see what actually happens next and how many more people will do these mergers and what this will actually look like, rather than just we're thinking about doing it.
Neil, if I look across the sort of bullet point list of cuts that are being telegraphed, highlighted, signalled, whatever. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the line from UK would have been, if we're not careful, we're going to have to cut these things. And we seem to have crossed a Rubicon here where the universities are now relatively brazenly saying, look, we are cutting these things. And some of those things are much more noticeable from a student point of view than others, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really worrying stuff that's come out this week on bursaries and the impact that we're starting to have there. That's probably emphasising the unfairness that was already in the system. There were parts of this that weren't great to start with. It was always pretty unfair, wasn't it? It was always in the 9K fees regime. It was always the institutions that had more to start with that were able then to give more out to the students that needed it, and that's disappeared a bit, and that's got even harder. I think so. Yes, it is definitely getting noticeable to students, and I think when we come on to talk about belonging later, I think there's definitely a relationship there. I think on the previous point that Emma and James are talking about in terms of those mergers and what are those conditions that allow it as well. I think you've also got to look at the fact of where there is an incentive to do so. So it looks like there's an immediate financial incentive, but is there? And where is an incentive for a really strong university to weaken its balance sheet by helping out someone else that's struggling? Because that is going against the role as a board. And it is going against what the OFS is kind of telling you to do. So I think there is a need for someone to talk there openly about some transition funding, because why would a strong university help someone out at this point? Because all it would do would put them into financial metrics that get the OFS looking at them in the way they don't want.
Just on that, Neil, right? So one of the joys of working at Wonkhe is pursuing esoteric and bizarre things, and I've done quite a lot of stuff on federations. And across the world, if you look at Paris Science and Letters, if you look at University of Arts Singapore, you generally need a form of government legislation or enabling or funding or a building or something to make it happen. And I think what's interesting about someone like Cranfield and Kings, Cranfield is almost like the poster child for all the government policy they want. They're specialists, they attract international students, they're working in defence. But nonetheless, the way they ensure their success is by merging with a comprehensive university. I'm not really sure what the collaboration regime that fulfills the government's need for having more specific education provision with more expansive economic and social output. The other bit on the funding point, I think the nature of the bursary cuts is equally important, because there are bursaries which we would think has been really progressive about how do you get the poorest kids into getting the best higher education. But there are the kinds of bursaries which are like, you have good A levels and we want you to come here, here's some cash. So if there is a really clear vision, which is like, we're going to have less funding but a more progressive system, it would be great for someone to put their hand up and articulate that. Because otherwise the narrative is, as Jim says, oh, we're just cutting stuff and now we're going to have to try and style it out as best we can.
You're right. And then hanging over this is again, demography. When you look at a declining market as well, what is our response to that? Because this is the burning platform. So on top of that, where you've got the predatory behaviour of those kind of bursaries you're talking about, how does that then worsen again the position of people that are already stressed?
But I mean, there's no getting away from it, is there, Emma? I mean, the figures I've crunched this week tell us that on cash help for students, this is per student actually helped. This is kind of money from the university going into students' bank accounts. In the Russell Group, £2,675 per person helped. In post-92s, it's fallen 40% over, a decade to about 1,122 quid. It can't be right, can it? That the financial help that students get is dependent on how many other students at a particular university need help?
No, and I mean, the other data here that I think is also very interesting is that 29% had said that they were cutting student support services as well. So that's actually slightly higher than the bursaries and the scholarships number as well. So I think all of this is adding to a picture where we are an area that has previously been said that we're not considering cutting this area, that no one and no service is no longer safe in terms of these cost cuts. And I think something that I found really interesting in this research was the kind of juxtaposition between that we've got 65% of institutions increasing delivery of transnational education, 63% opening new undergraduate degree programs, 63% increasing new postgrad taught programs. These are all like positive things, but this is at odds with these staffing-based cost-saving initiatives and this reducing of student bursaries and hardship funding. And where does this all kind of fit in? Because to me, this feels very contradictory. And all I can think about as well as students and what that is impacting on their experiences, and again, we'll talk about that later, particularly around student belonging, is around how are the university staff dealing with this? How is the well-being of university staff here? Because you've got academic staff that are grappling with changes to the courses. You've got new academic staff being recruited on these short-term contracts. You've got the academic staff not having their contracts renewed because of these changes. Then you've got the professional services staff who are trying to support students who are, as you've said, Jim, like reduced funding available, also going through voluntary redundancies, having reduced staff teams at a time when students are in need of support that is increasing, there's increasingly complex needs. And all of this is this big melting pot where we also don't know what it's going to look like the next year or the year after. So whether that's in terms of student-facing cuts as well as staff-facing cuts, which automatically become student-facing cuts. Yeah.
I think if you look at stuff like the white paper as well, the post-16, Emma, we end up in this really bizarre situation where it's like we want 2/3 of young people to get higher technical qualifications. You have a regulatory regime which in theory should be pushing a more diverse intake of students. And at the same time, you have to do that cheaper. I don't really know what the world is of having a bigger, more diverse labour market ready sector that is done for significantly less money than we have today. That seems impossible to me to do.
I mean, Neil, it's interesting this, isn't it? Because, there's no doubt that there's some interesting comparisons to be done with other higher education systems around the world. Certainly, I've banged on about this in terms of Europe before. But back here in the UK, I've not really seen anyone other than the kind of, the big, naughty, nasty, pilot high, sell it cheap above a betting shop franchises that are speaking with clarity and vision about coping on a much lower unit of resource than we perhaps coped on 7 or 8 years ago. A lot of this still feels like squeezing and muddling through, or am I missing a model somewhere?
No, I don't think you necessarily are. I think what we've got is a system that has gone through its creaking and as we have regularly said in this parish is now breaking. I think what you will start to see is people coming up with models, because I think what we're starting to see in reports like this and in other news around the sector, that the salami slicing, even the more surgical cutting, it is reaching a limit. So it is going to have to be a model shift that starts to do it. Demography will push some of that. LLE maybe a nudge towards some of that. But you're quite right. There is a need for us to think about a different model of delivery to allow this to move forward, unless the unit of resource changes, and none of us expect the unit of resource to change. And isn't that scary?
Yeah. And I guess, Jimbo, part of the problem with that is, for all of the innovation that there is in any part of the sector, either here or anywhere else, people have a set of expectations, don't they, that sort of play out every week, every day on the news and in phone-ins and in the press about what a university is, what it's for, what it does, what the experience is like. And if we're talking about something radical, it feels like we're going to be talking about, to some extent, disappointment with how it turns out in relation to what people expect it to be like. The imagined small group seminar, the imagined students sitting under a tree bumping into some other students because they've got some spare time and they can chat to them, the imagined volunteering experience, the imagined help you get from a personal tutor. None of these things potentially feel viable with the sorts of models we're having to shift to in this kind of late stage massification.
I don't know why, but in the way you described the campus experience, it made me think of the film Clueless there, where people just wandering around bumping into each other, bumping into their tutors. But I think there's a few things in that, Jim. Like, there is a world where you could say, for a reasonable period of time, we had that, where there was a period, let's say from 2012 up until basically Brexit and COVID, where for all the fee system was still grossly unfair, you had more money for access, more money for support, more money for teaching. The issue is that as the pressures grow, the urgent need for commercialisation grows, which then leads to some of the behaviours you described: bigger classrooms, fewer teachers, fewer support, etc. But I think there's two issues with the diagnosis. One is that there's only so much universities can do, and they simply respond to the incentives that are put in front of them. And if the incentive that is put in front of them is to say that you do not make any money, any surplus, from teaching home students, undergraduate teaching is intensive and costly, and the top-up grant does not allow you to teach the things that the government is saying is important. And then on the other hand, the incentive is not about those kind of incidental experiences for students, because they have to go to work. So I think universities find themselves in this really, really strange position where I'm sure for all the will in the world, they're trying to radically reshape their model, but their ability to radically reshape the model is stymied by an incentive and policy structure that absolutely makes no sense to allow them to do it. Like the radical version of the incentive is to have a very, very small postgraduate international-based provider. Cranfield did that, and now they're merging with King's.
Now, here's a question for mainly for Emma and Neil, but do chip in, Jimbo. So later on today, I am rocking up at an online Keel debate. Keel's been running these debates, and the VC, Kevin, is going to start with quite an interesting intro that says, in my last semester at university as an undergraduate, I did a project with a professor who was nearly impossible to contact, grumpy if you managed to get hold of him, and gave no useful advice. The project was unstructured and unsettling. As a result, it was by far the most useful experience I had at university, preparing me for the reality of a world that doesn't set clear learning outcomes or ensure that assessments are fair. I worry that the university system we have helped to create is obsessed with student satisfaction scores to the detriment of helping students prepare for a tough and competitive world. And this is a debate titled Helping or Hindering? Broadly, do we support students too much? Emma.
Oh, thanks. I think that's really interesting. I think it speaks to, he's starting with, in my experience, and we're all guilty of it, but our experience now is no longer unless you graduated last year, I would argue that our experience now is not the same as what it is. Well, our experience before, is not the same as what it is now to be a student. And increasingly, the world is getting difficult to navigate. Universities are changing. And so whether or not we're supporting students too much, I think you have to look at what is the expectations on universities to begin with from other places, so regulatory and governmental kind of influence. And HEPI, I think it was last year, did a report, Professor Edward Peck, who's now the OFS, kind of released this report about these expectations of society on universities, and this idea that external kind of sectors or kind of people, so parents, social media, other sectors like health services, etc. There's all an expectation on universities around what they should be doing to support students that hasn't been there before and is only going to increase. And so I think whilst academic staff member or university staff might think that this is going, that there's more and more pressures, it's not just down to them. If they decided to stop, I don't think that would be considered acceptable by students, parents of students, and so forth. So I think that's I don't think it's for universities to be answering. I think it's a wider societal kind of question.
But I guess, Neil, if we talked a couple of weeks ago on the podcast actually about the big report that had come out about European massification. If I compare your average, UK university, staff-student ratios are better, and professional services staff, particularly student support staff, there are higher numbers. And I guess the argument is simultaneous here. One, that costs a fortune. Two, we haven't got the money. Three, it might not be helping students on the macro level in the long run.
Yes, I think you've got to think a little bit about what level of dropout rate you accept as well, because I think one of the things that we're saying is we're desperately trying to get students into the system and then keep them there. If you rip out the student support that we've put in for a generation that have undergone the trauma of COVID, social media, or like without restriction, just let rip an employment crisis, with parents that graduated into a financial crash. If you pull all of that away, your dropout rates are going to go up. And that is not something that our system is set up for. And I don't think it's something that we should be seeking. So no, we shouldn't be trying to make it difficult and say, well, yes, it was really hard and 50% of the people dropped out. And doesn't that show that the system was successful? That's not what we're trying to achieve, is it? So no, we shouldn't be ripping these things away, but we have to be doing them in context. And I think, again, it goes back to, are we doing a demand-led system or a supply-led system? And we seem incapable as a nation for having that debate.
I mean, it's not the Hunger Games, Jim. It's like, we're not trying to get these sorts of the fittest, most compact-ready students are able to survive the higher education system. I think there is a debate about what is the legitimate boundary of student support versus other services in a place, like the NHS, health providers, etc. But the problem is you spend that long trying to coordinate services that students would fall down the gaps in the meantime. And also politically, I'm not sure what the argument would be to say, we recognise it's really hard being a student. In order for you to survive, we've actually made it even more difficult because we think that's really good for your character. Like, I wouldn't send my child there.
But part of it, Jimbo, right, is, one of the things in that UK survey is that 4/5 of the respondents have had hiring freezes, voluntary redundancies, more than 2/3 have got compulsories on the table, right? And I guess if you're not salami slicing, if you're not just doing the kind of blunt 2% cuts, 4% cuts across the board, what you're having to do is pick something and say, right, we're going to take a risk and hope that this doesn't impact all the things that matter. And maybe it's the dropout rate that matters, maybe it's satisfaction that matters. Different things will matter to different universities. But I guess part of the problem is no one has counterfactuals in this scenario, do they?
No, and also we don't know what combination of things individual providers are doing. So it might be that some are focusing on cutting research and cutting services staff. Some might be focusing on bursaries, some might be on hardships, etc. I suppose when you read across this, the thing that really stands out is there's not a sense of anybody specialising in a thing. So it would be a legitimate choice to say, we are the provider who invests so much in student services that we make sure everybody passes no matter what. And the consequence of that is we teach fewer programmes at higher intensity. There is then also a legitimate choice to say, yes, we have good student support, but our focus is on X, Y, or Z thing. The thing in the end which will kill the sector is by mushing into this complete nothingness of a slightly worse version of the things that everybody had before. There is no appeal in that, but that also depends on government putting in the architecture and transition funding and policy and regulations, and even things like thinking about competition law to actually allow providers to specialise. It is fine to say, yes, you have to make a choice, but there is no motivation to make the choice when there simply isn't the policy framework to do it. So you just cut things, because that is all that is in front of you.
Right, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hello, I'm Marcela Cazzoli from Durham University, and together with my co-author Ana de Medeiros, we wrote a recent article for Wonkhe titled Modern Languages Has a Future and It Starts with Access and Inclusivity. In it, we wanted to challenge a very common assumption that modern languages are declining simply because students are no longer interested. An argument is that this is really a question of access as much as demand. Too many young people never get a genuine opportunity to continue with languages at school, so by the time they reach university, inequalities are already built into the system. That's why beginners or ab initio language provision matters so much. These programs are not just remedial or second best, but for many students, they're the first real opportunity to study a language formally. In our article, we suggest that if we want a sustainable future for languages in UK higher education, expanding access has to be central to the conversation.
Now, next up, international students. It's not getting better. Emma, Home Office visa data's out for Q1. Headline number is pretty striking.
Yeah, so at the end of last week, Pi News, which is an international education news outlet, released new research which found that the number of study visas issued to main international applicants in the first quarter of the year is at the lowest level for years. And in fact, it's more than 30% down based on data from the same time last year. So this new research also spotlights the practices of some institutions where they're requiring non-refundable deposits from international students at a time where students from countries such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Ghana are increasingly being refused a study visa. So one of the really stark findings is that 40% of Pakistani applicants were refused a study visa for the UK this year, compared to just 6% in 2025. So Jim's already covered this on the site, and this research is also echoing other research we've seen over the past year from people like UK, UKISA and others on the experiences of prospective international students in UK VI credibility decisions.
Now, Neil, we don't know this, but visa refusals and withdrawals are both, through the roof, actually. I mean, it was really striking when I was crunching the numbers to the day. And that, surely the only explanation for that is UK VI processing delays in January, or am I missing another factor?
I don't think you are, and I think it's as has been discussed on the site. It feels like the system's being reshaped by stealth rather than statute, and that's not great. And it's a strange response to a public concern around immigration to go for an area of immigration that appears to be of least concern to the public. So it looks like, yes, there are increasingly spurious decisions being made that are reshaping our sector, and in the one area that has been used to support the finances of a sector that is challenged, that is then emphasised, that is then making the financial strain even greater. We need again to have a proper discussion about what this is, and maybe in a Labour leadership challenge to come, we will have a discussion about what our international education strategy is and where that fits, and what it's doing to us as a nation to say, look, we have a world-class strategic asset in our universities. Do we want them to be propped up on a cash grab in some post-colonial nightmare? No. Do we want them to be part of a world-class system that not only helps fund education for British young people, but is also part of something that puts us into the top league of nations through our soft power? Well, yes, surely that's the educational strategy that we're looking to have. None of that is helped by something happening in quite a murky way to reduce our international recruitment and influence. So again, it is a need for an actual policy discussion and debate around what it is we're trying to do here.
Jimbo, before we, let me zoom out for a second. British Social Attitude Survey, really interesting stuff in there. Most of Britain thinks that net migration is still rising. And yet, I am staring at a chart here that suggests that it has absolutely collapsed. Part of that is, what some of the things that is data lag actually with international students. Some of it is international students not being able to stay and find work. But either way, I'm also staring at another chart that I'm going to present later, actually, at this thing I'm at today. Looking at the kind of birth rate, we got stats this week suggesting that the birth rate has collapsed. Medium to long term, we need immigration, don't we?
Yeah, we're going to be a smaller, poorer country. There is no getting away from that unless we do something. I think the thing that just rattles me about this entire thing, Jim, is that it is not only short-sighted, it is politically terrible to imagine this is the route for Labour to win an election. You're not going to put on the side of a bus when you're against reform saying, we have net migration, but by the way, there is still some net migration, because reform will just get a bigger bus which says no net migration, and there's still some. That is the end of the debate. It makes absolutely no sense, and I think it is nothing short of moral and political cowardice to not have the debate up front. We are going to wreck one of our very few leading international industries in higher education to move the needle on net migration to win 0 votes. It makes absolutely no sense. And the people, and this is what makes me most angry about this, the people who will be most affected by this are the people who live in the towns where people will say, oh, well, they're pro-leave, so therefore they're anti-migration, or, oh, they have a sort of these views, etc., etc. Those are the people who depend, where there is often one institution in a place whose finances are precarious. They will not thank the Labour government when their major employer goes bust. And we will turn around and we'll say, well, it couldn't have happened, it's structural shortcomings in the sector. No, it's rubbish. Something could have been done about it, and it's a political choice not to. And I think the country would be devastated by it. It is absolutely appalling.
I mean, one of the things that appears to be, behind this kind of fairly stealthy set of things that has happened, particularly in, the last quarter, 2026, the January entrance, Emma, is this stuff about the credibility interview process. I mean, there have been some grimly amusing, and I stress grimly amusing stories about those credibility interviews that I think UKI must have highlighted to the Times. But part of my sense of this, am I misreading this, is that if we treat international applicants quite badly, and then, potentially through, some of the stuff we're talking about in item 1, we treat international students quite badly, medium to long term, that really does not help our soft power, does it?
Of course not. If a student on application feels like, they've had a pretty rough ride to get there and they still get in, and then they're here and they feel like the experience they have received is not really what they were hoping for, or they don't have the best time, and then they're being told that they can't stay in a country to work, even though they have the skills required, no wonder that potentially they're going to feel like they've been given a bit of a raw deal. And I think also thinking about how universities manage all of this. So these experiences happen, and the credibility process, some of the kind of findings around how a student was denied because they said that there was something to do with Norfolk and the person didn't realise that it was a county that they were referring to. Now, if a student gets in, a lot of the people that are picking up the pieces are going to be the university staff who had no hand in that. But I often think that student services, particularly, or just professional services, and all of the people that make universities run outside of academic departments are essentially going to be treated like the wet paper towel you used to get at primary school if you fell over, which didn't really do the job, but maybe tried to make you feel a little bit better. That's going to be where this falls. So, student services will often include things like international student support, and that will include the transition between these credibility processes into university, and also managing where perhaps they've been told wrong information or slightly massaged information from, third-party agents or whoever. So I think I'd be interested to find out a bit more about the international student experience from this period and whether or not that's massively changing given all what's happening, and given that international students are coming into the UK during this time where other people have said already they're being kind of treated as other and are not necessarily being welcomed in the same way they were, 5-10 years ago.
I'm not sure I could point to all the counties on a map, Emma. And I've lived here for 33 years. I think it's such a telling anecdote. I mean, Emma, on your point, the other thing about sort of this soft power, I think it'll also impact our hard power as well. So I did a report with UK 2 or 3 years ago on the proportions of international PGR students that make up some key areas for the UK's global strength. 72% of all economics PGR students are international students. For AI, it's about 50%. For computer scientists, about 56%. So it's not even that through these measures, we are depriving ourselves of the intellectual capabilities of some of the world's brightest people. We're also eroding the confidence and the pipeline into the very things which will protect the UK's economic future.
I mean, Neil, clearly all this is true. But, on the flip side, one of the things actually Pi News talked about this week, and I've also talked about on the site, is, the reality is with all the BCA compliance metrics, lots of universities, to some extent, are managing some of those risks through really quite high tuition fee deposits, and then policies that say those deposits are not refundable if you fail the credibility interview. So I'm sat here thinking, okay, so on the one hand, the sector is saying the credibility interview process is, rigged. And then on the other hand, it appears on paper that a whole bunch of universities are then keeping half of a year's tuition fees off the back of a student failing what UUK is saying is a rigged credibility interview. That can't be right, can it?
No, but isn't it just a product of the system that we've been discussing, of financial challenge and of a system that no one is quite sure what the rules are anymore? And because we don't know the rules, people are making these fairly immoral decisions, or completely immoral decisions, let's be honest there, Jim, that are depriving people of their money for no benefit on a basis of a system, as you've said, that is declining in trust. So, yeah, and I mean, it's a matter of time before those get challenged. Again, as you've written on the site, someone's going to be challenging that, aren't they? And what is the legal basis for which people are doing it? But when you look again at the sector's finances, you can understand the meeting that signed that off, can't you?
I mean, Jimbo, it's kind of interesting to me, this, because because it's a bit, for me, this is a bit like free speech. Increasingly, I see lots of aspects of government policy in relation to universities and other sectors too, actually, as here's a big sandbag on one end of a seesaw, here's another, finger wagging about those sandbags, and no one ever helping people resolve how you actually manage the seesaw. You must do X, you must do Y. X and Y aren't immediately obviously compatible, but the government tactic is just finger wag on one end of a seesaw on a given day for a press release or a 8 on Radio 4. And this is it feels like it's putting public service leaders, and I include universities in that, in this increasing range of completely impossible positions.
Yeah, I just love, by the way, Jim, is there an issue in higher education which isn't actually about freedom of speech in the end? It all comes back. It all comes back to it.
We need Livia on.
We need Livia on. But I think there's two issues here, right? This is effectively peddling a soft student numbers cap through various fiddling, meddling, slowing down of the systems. It's similar to the debate that we just had, is that if there is going to be actually we think the system should look like this, not like this, we should plan to do that rather than doing it retrospectively. And I think the other part of this is universities are playing by the rules of the game in front of them. And there is an enforcement regime that says to them, when you are not playing the rules of the game, we will act, UKVI, etc. This is neither of those things, whereas there's neither an upfront discussion or policy debate about we think the system should look like this, we think there should be this kind of international makeup, we think it should be this kind of home students, which, by the way, when it comes to stipendiary funding for research, that already happens. There's limitations on the amount of international students it goes to, but nor is it a clear regulatory intervention they'd expect from the Office for Students. So universities find themselves stuck in the middle of trying to manage the system the best they can with the rules they have today, and then weirdly, seemingly getting punished for it.
Every one of us who works in higher education knows our own patch pretty well. Far few of us can hold the whole picture: funding, teaching, research, students, data, governance, people strategy, all of it at once. That's the gap that Making Sense of Higher Education is built to close. It's a new programme from Wonkhe. 10 live online modules, 1 hour each, running from October to April, delivered by the team you already listened to on this podcast, plus special guests across the series. It's built for people new to the sector, for governors, for mid-career professionals, and for academic leaders who want something different. Early bird tickets are open now. There's 10% off until the 31st of July. Further discounts are available for Wonkhe subscriber organisations and large groups. You can find the full programme and book your place at wonkhe.com/events.
Now, finally this week, belonging, and specifically, we've got a report out that looks hard at what it is, how it's produced, what it predicts, and so on. Now, Neil, you've read Friends Have Benefits. What are the headlines?
I have. It's look, I think firstly it's really important to say this is a really robust report in terms of the number of students, 19,000-ish students across the UK. And I think it's really important to go beyond just the headlines here, because, some of the headlines we're talking about is that, 79% of our students say that they belong isn't that good. But that's masking a lot underneath. And I think where there's some really interesting findings in here is what different types of friendships on a campus and in a university do for students. You've got students with friends both on their course and outside of it. You've got students with friends in only one of those, and then students that are reporting having no friends. And what that does to their experience across the board is very interesting and starts to have some policy implications. So you've got a third of students saying they feel that they belong, but are also still regularly lonely. That's not something we've talked about in the sector before. We've tended to measure belonging as meaning that you're not feeling lonely. And I think when the report moves to talk about what we could do about it, or how we start to reframe this, that structural issue around belonging and how you make friendship as an infrastructure around campus is really interesting, and how it fits around teaching and feedback, and what that course architecture looks like in partnership with student services and students' unions is really interesting. So, have we been measuring belonging wrong all along, and do we need a more nuanced understanding? Probably. How do we start to design courses around that genuine peer connection, and what does that do to the experience? That's really interesting. and then also looking at who's missing out and where are those gaps, because you'd start breaking down the demography again, and then there are areas in our student population that have been missing out for a long time on bits of the experience that are again coming out in this survey as having a notably worse experience than others.
I mean, look, Emma, I tell this story a lot, but years ago when we did some original polling on belonging, I remember it was the first few weeks actually, I was working at Wonkhe, and one of the things I said was that, people need friendships. And actually the late Claire Callender, of all people, challenged me and said, well, I don't think this is true for mature students and commuter students. They already have friends. This is a very dated way of looking at the student experience. And, one of my conclusions going through, with Mac putting this piece of work together has been that there's no doubt that if you have pre-existing friendship networks, that helps with some aspects, with mental health, for example, but that actually a lot of what matters is having friends in your subject area. And my sense is that we're not very good really in the UK at working out the kind of differences between the different sorts of social networks, the kind of social capital that students potentially have, other than just saying, oh, you're lonely or not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's there's a couple of really important points here. So I think Neil's already referenced it, but the belonging is not a proxy for loneliness. And I think that's really important to bring out here, because you can belong, but you can still feel lonely. And I think if we're thinking about, you mentioned about mature students, commuter students, I think belonging, if we're talking about belonging in terms of the institution, you might feel like you deserve or you belong to an institution, but you still feel lonely. And we know that mature students, commuter students are at greater risk of feeling lonely. And I think partly because they're also potentially less likely to make these university friends. Now, if we're thinking about academic course friends, they're like the people that get what you're doing, right? So they're the people you can ask about, oh, how are you going to do this assignment? Or what are you doing around that? Or actually, did you understand what that lecturer was talking about? Because I actually have no idea. Those are the kind of soft conversations that if you've got those academic friendships or acquaintances that can really kind of stop that or go some way to stop alienating that student and then decreasing their sense of belonging. So I think that I don't know, I personally would disagree with this idea that mature students and commuter students don't need these friendships because they have other friendships. Because I think that actually what this research has demonstrated is that all of these other friendships are important, but these academic friendships are particularly important because they're going to be almost like that anchor around supporting you in your academic course.
Jimbo, one of the things that, actually I've been presenting for a couple of years now is a kind of version of the stats in here, an earlier version of the stats that says, look, if you have no friends, you have moderately low satisfaction with the level of support you get from your university. If you've got friends on your course, you've got really high satisfaction. And the question I've always had back to me is, well, where's the correlation? Where's the causation in that correlation? Is it that, people who have got loads of friends on their course are just hanging around more often, easier to contact staff, the sort of traditional student? Or is it that having mates on your course kind of enables you to, depend less on the support you might get from a personal tutor or from, a student services or whatever? And I'm fairly confident, actually, having spent weeks now with Mac ploughing through the free text responses, that what we've uncovered is, even if you spend hardly any time on campus, if you've got mates in your subject area, that opens up all sorts of access to parts of the university, but crucially reduces your dependency on lots of those things. And back to item one with massification, we need social structures that can do lateral support as well as direct support from universities to students, don't we?
I'm not an expert in friends and friendship in the same way our colleagues are, other than my own experiences. I suppose intuitively it makes sense that if I have a network of people who can help me with the relatively low-level annoyances of being at universities, like timetabling, what's going on in my program, can I get some advice, then the value add of expert services that can't cover those things inevitably feels bigger. In the same way that if I go to the doctor frequently and get a load of low-level ailments treated, I might feel like, oh, I could have just gone to the pharmacy, versus something very serious. I value that level of expertise more. Not to say the pharmacy is an expertise. I sort of would suspect it's that kind of effect, but otherwise I wouldn't be sure. My only other theory would be, is it context dependent on the kinds of friendships? So if my friendships are centered around my program the way that Emma describes, it might be that I have the kind of social network that is more related to my interests, and therefore my experience with student services are fewer and more infrequent. Or it helps to shape my approaches to the student services and my ability to self-advocate more strongly, because I have a network of people who can advise me more effectively before I even access them.
I mean, Neil, one of my reflections is that we're pretty good in the UK actually at causing students to have opportunities to find friendships across a university. You know, our freshers fairs really are some of the best freshers fairs that I've seen, certainly in Europe. I mean, I'm not comparing to, some of the wild expenditure in the US, but that actually relatively comparatively, we just have less infrastructure around this academic citizenship thing. This, I'm a geographer, I'm a historian, I'm an engineer. And there are potentially implications, I guess, both for program teams and schools and departments, but also student unions there.
There really are. And actually, in the process of preparing for this and looking through the details of the research, I'm already making notes about talking to various people across the institution. When you look at things like career readiness and friendships, is one of the best things we can do to help our students into employment, to help them find course friendships, because that's probably not in your employability strategy. And from the looks of this, it should be. And how does a student union support with that? So, one of the things that we do is we've been working to try and guarantee that there will be an active course community on every cluster of programs at the institution. And it's bloody hard. Some of them are already there and we can help foster those, but some of them, it never has quite been there. But you can also correlate that to students who aren't as happy and aren't as career ready. So it becomes a strategic imperative for the institution then to create an architecture that encourages students to interact with one another and have support networks beyond just, it's nice to have friends, but it's not really important. And, that anecdote you told at the start, I was, 10 years ago, I was a mature part-time postgraduate commuting. Of course I wanted some course friends. I wanted to talk about my course.
You may not have wanted to play hockey with them, but you definitely wanted someone to chit-chat to.
Absolutely. Someone that after a lecture or before a lecture to see around campus and have a coffee with. Of course you want that, because that makes you feel part of it. Whereas otherwise it becomes quite a bland and transactional experience, which isn't what university is supposed to be. So if you want it to be more than transactional, and everyone in UK higher education you speak to wants it to be more than transactional, you've got to deliver on the opportunities to make it more than transactional.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we've discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes on wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So huge thanks to Emma, Neil, James, Michael, Salmon for making it happen behind the scenes, even though he's not actually here this week. We'll be back next week. Mark will be here. Until then, stay wonk.